everyone, and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the weird, obscure, and forgotten parts of Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and in this episode, I'll be talking to you about the Irish woman who brought down a king, Lola Montez. Lola was born plain old Eliza Gilbert in Sligo in 1821. She was named after her mother, who was the daughter of the Irish MP Charles Oliver. Her father was an English soldier named Edward Gilbert. The year after his daughter was born, Edward transferred out of his unit and took a posting to India. It was a big step for the new family, but it promised an increase in both pay and excitement. So they set out, but tragedy was waiting en route. At some point during the long journey, Edward contracted cholera. By the time they arrived in Dinapore, where he had been posted, the disease was in its final stages. By the date he had been due to report for duty, he was dead. The widow Eliza moved to Calcutta and considered her options. The only real viable one was remarriage. Fortunately, she was an attractive 19-year-old with a pleasant manner, and it was not difficult for her to find a new husband. Lieutenant Patrick Craigie from Montrose in Scotland was the lucky man. By all reports, he was as fond of Lola as if she was his own daughter, but the headstrong young girl was a handful, throwing tantrums and resisting all attempts to discipline her. It was decided to send her back to Scotland. Craigie's father was a chemist who had raised 9 children, and maybe he would have better luck. But it was not to be. The celebrity of being the strange Indian girl had a stronger effect on Lola than anything else. 4 years later, her stepfather's sister Catherine moved to Durham to set up a boarding school. Lola was one of the first pupils enrolled. A year later, her stepfather, by now a captain, had her put in an exclusive ladies' school, the Aldridge Academy in Bath. Here, French was treated as a first language, and this enforced multilinguality would serve Lola well in the years to come. It was also here that the foundations of her dancing career were laid, though the stern women who ran the academy would have had little inkling of what use their instruction would be put to. When Lola was 16, her mother arranged a respectable marriage for her, but Lola didn't want to be respectable. She eloped with a visiting officer, a friend of her stepfather, named Thomas James. The marriage devastated her mother and outraged her father's family. Lola's marriage with Thomas was profoundly unhappy. When he was reposted to India, she accompanied him, returning for the first time in over a decade to her childhood home. There she left him, possibly due to his physical abuse. Her mother tried to persuade the two to reconcile, but it didn't last. On a boat trip back to London, Lola had a blatant affair with another passenger, a lieutenant named Lennox, and back in England the two continued their relationship. Eventually, this led to her husband seeking and receiving a divorce. This was a huge scandal at the time. Her family disowned her, and her mother even started wearing mourning clothes. Her daughter Eliza was dead to her. But from this death rose a new person, the mysterious, exotic dancer Lola Montez. The debut of the Spanish dancer Lola Montez in London was initially a success, and her performance finished to thunderous applause and rave reviews in the papers. Those in the audience who recognized her so-called Spanish dancing as completely fake were drowned out by the cheers. The main draw was the disarrangement of her skirts revealing her bare legs. Rich stuff for the Victorian stage. People ate it up, until Lola fell foul of the great Victorian hypocrisy. The English in the 19th century were simultaneously obsessed with and repelled by sex. Female performers on stage were generally expected to make themselves sexually available to the upper class. Ballet dancers, for example, were paid less than a living wage, as it was expected they'd find a rich lover to support them. This was a tradition dating back centuries, with Nell Gwyn, mistress to King Charles II, being the most famous example. But despite this, and the clearly sexual nature of Lola's dancing, there was still an expectation of outwards morality. This meant that as soon as someone recognized Lola as the notorious adulteress Eliza James, it was the end of her career in London. She was forced to leave the city and moved to somewhere much more comfortable with its sexual identity, Paris. The controversy around her departure from London helped to raise her profile, and she snared at least one highly born admirer, Prince Heinrich of Leipzig. He took her as a mistress, though she proved to be a touch too lively for his taste. So he got rid of her by arranging a series of appearances in Dresden, which soon led to an engagement in Berlin. There she met with a mixed reception. Her sensuality won over the crowd, but her lack of technique and variety offended the critics. Here again, however, her knack for catching the eyes of the rich and famous served her well. She wound up dancing at a reception held by Friedrich the Great for the Tsar of Russia. A quick rise for a woman with a professional dancing career measured in months. In 1843 she moved to Warsaw, which at the time was ruled by the same Russian Tsar she had danced for in Berlin. This was where she first began to be involved in radical politics. The manager of the theatre, Colonel Ignacy Abramowitsch, was somewhat alarmed by this, as he was also the city's chief of police. He arranged for the audience at one of his performances to be filled with his stooges. They would boo and hiss, and this would give him an excuse to fire her. However, her fans at the event took her side, and a riot threatened to break out. Lola, with her usual flair for the dramatic, took the opportunity to denounce the colonel, declaring that his outrage came from her refusal to submit to his infamous proposals. Lola could have become a rallying point for resistance against the Russian occupation, so the regime expelled her from Poland. With word of her rabble-rousing tendencies going ahead of her, she received a chilly welcome in St. Petersburg, and only made a single appearance on stage before having to move on. This left her with no solid goals, until she read a newspaper article about the composer Franz Liszt. He was, at the time, the most popular musician in Europe. Lola used her contacts to arrange first a meeting and then a relationship. She travelled around Europe with him, meeting people like Wagner, who disliked her intensely. The relationship didn't last, though. Lola got tired of playing second fiddle to the great man and began making scenes in public to get attention away from him. One story is that when Liszt finally got tired of her, he sneaked out while she was asleep to avoid the inevitable fiery tantrum his leaving would provoke. Regardless of how the relationship ended, when Lola left Dresden, she headed for Paris with a full set of introductory letters from Liszt. For a long time, she had declared her intention to conquer the Parisian stage, and now she had been given the keys to its gate. The name of Liszt and her own charm soon gained her a following, and pressure mounted for her to be allowed to take the stage of the prestigious Paris Opera to dance El Oleana, one of the few dances she actually knew. Unfortunately, however, the audience at the opera knew a lot more about dancing than her usual crowd. Lola's lack of skill and experience stood out like a sore thumb. She made 2 appearances, but was not invited for a third. Even her fraudulent Spanish origin was an open secret, though this fact did not really make much of a dent in her popularity. Instead, she settled into the bohemian side of Paris society, becoming known for her surprising talent for pistol shooting. Alexandre Dumas became her friend, and he said of Lola, quote, "She is fatal to any man who dares to love her." Unfortunately, this soon proved to be entirely true. Alexandre Henri Dujarrier was the editor of La Presse, one of the first mass-market newspapers in France. He had seen Lola on stage. Regardless of the merits of the dancing, he had fallen desperately in love with the dancer. He managed to get backstage and introduced himself, and his influence was a large part of what got her accepted in the Parisian artistic community. Here she found a spiritual home, and when Dujarrier proposed marriage, she accepted. The terms of her divorce with Henry James made this bigamy, but it's doubtful if Lola even considered that. Turned out not to matter, as the marriage never took place. Dujarrier attended a party at the Palais Royal. He asked Lola to stay home, as he thought it would be a rough crowd. He went himself because a friend had invited him, and he thought it would be rude to refuse. While there, he got into an argument over a card game with Jean-Baptiste de Beauvoir, a journalist from a rival newspaper. The argument led to Dujarrier challenging him to a duel. The next morning, he regretted his foolishness, but his honour refused to let him back down, and the duel went ahead. Dujarrier fired first and missed, then dropped his pistol and accepted his fate. His opponent, a more practiced shot, took careful aim and fired. This was a breach of the code of dueling, but that didn't change anything. Dujarrier was killed, and Lola's heart was broken. Needing to get away from Paris for a while, Lola headed to Bonn. At the time, it was hosting a great music festival in honor of Beethoven's 75th anniversary. It was organized by her old friend Liz, though the two didn't rekindle their romance. Lola began traveling around Europe, leaving scandal and broken hearts behind her. Among her conquests was Robert Peel, son of the former English Prime Minister. En route to Vienna, she passed through Munich, the capital of Bavaria. While there, she got an engagement to dance on stage in the Royal Theatre during the intervals. Her dancing caught the eye of the king, Ludwig I, and the two immediately hit it off. The king was a fan of both beautiful women and all things Spanish, and Lola entranced him, even more so once he had seen her dance. The public response to the performance was mixed, but there was no doubt that Ludwig was smitten. The 60-year-old monarch even began composing love poems to her in Spanish. The relationship soon became official as such things get, anyway, and Lola became the king's mistress. Lola proved very unpopular with Bavarian high society. Her extravagant lifestyle and loose manner scandalized them, and her radical politics outraged them. This intensified the following year in 1847, when Ludwig granted her the title of Countess of Landsfeld. The fact that the court was against him didn't faze Ludwig, and he used it as an excuse to assert his authority with them. Lola soon began to use her influence for her own ends. Sometimes this was for laudable causes, such as increasing the salaries of school teachers. Sometimes this was for less noble ends, like her long-running feud with the Jesuits. Though she had been raised a Protestant, her pose as a Spanish noblewoman meant that she was pretending to be a Catholic. The Jesuits had tried to recruit her as an agent, and she hadn't taken it well. The fact that she was trying to gain power made the government nervous, and the Bavarian intelligence service soon found itself digging up whatever dirt it could on Lola. As you can guess, there was a lot of dirt to dig up. Confronted with this evidence, the king was shaken, but he eventually came down on Lola's side. However, revolution was beginning to sweep across Europe, and all across Germany, liberals were taking to the streets demanding reforms. In Bavaria, counter-protests began to take hold not just against liberal reforms, but also against the foreign adventurers who had invaded their court. Munich University became divided by bitter clashes between conservative students and a radical group called the Alemannia, who idolized Lola and her politics. Eventually, mounting pressure forced the king to revoke her citizenship and her title of nobility and write an order for her arrest, though she fled to Switzerland ahead of the police. Less than 2 weeks later, faced with the prospect of being reduced to being a constitutional monarch, instead Ludwig abdicated in favour of his son Maximilian. Once again, Lola found herself cut adrift around Europe, and this time she fetched up in London, where she met and married a young British officer named George Heald. He was 20 to her 27, and the age difference as well as Lola's notoriety scandalized his family. One of them managed to identify her as Eliza James, and since the terms of her divorce with Henry James forbade remarriage, she was forced to flee the country to avoid arrest. George came with her, but the marriage gradually deteriorated. Lola's mercurial temperament wore him as raw as it did most people. In 1850 they separated. Heald moved to Lisbon, where he would drown 3 years later, while Lola, with her 30th birthday fast approaching, headed where people always headed when they were looking for a new start: the United States of America. Lola arrived in New York amid much fanfare and publicity. The idea of a real-life femme fatale who had toppled a kingdom set the public imagination ablaze, and Lola did not disappoint. Dressed in man's clothing and with her whip and pistol, she played the part to the hilt. She spent the best part of 3 years touring the west coast of America. Over this time, Lola's act evolved into a more burlesque style. Rather than ape the practiced dances of the professionals, as she had been mocked for trying to do in Paris, instead she embraced the sensuality of her dancing, while at the same time making the ridiculousness of it into a virtue. Nowhere was this more evident than in her spider dance, a variant on the Italian tarantella. She played the part of an innocent maid whose clothes had become infested with spiders. Naturally, this led to much rummaging around and disrobing. While her act would have been tame by modern standards, at the time it was racy, almost explosive stuff, and was a major influence on the evolving American burlesque scene. In 1853, Lola came to San Francisco. It was a wild town back then, filled with gold miners and very little government. Lola not only brought her spider dance to San Francisco, she also took to the stage as an actress. She was perfectly cast in a performance of School for Scandal as Lady Teasel, the flirtatious and spendthrift wife. Lola soon became the subject of scandal herself, as she married a local newspaper man named Patrick Hull. Lola performed at the American Theatre, where she was a big draw. Their rivals, the San Francisco Theatre, soon came up with a plan to steal some of her thunder. They put on a play specifically written to mock both Lola and her history, called Who's Got the Countess? The play was a thundering success, and many thought it too cruel in its humour. Whether it was this or her usual wanderlust, Lola moved on from San Francisco to the city of Grass Valley, where the gold rush was in full swing. Why the largest city in Nevada County was called Grass Valley, I don't know. Not the only strange thing about the city. It's got a strong sense of Cornish heritage, and it's one of the few places in the USA where pasties are commonly sold in stores. Lola doesn't seem to have been bothered about the pasties, but she did get into a feud with a local newspaper editor. She sent him a letter declaring, "You may choose between my dueling pistols, or take your choice of a pill out of a pillbox. One shall be poisoned, and the other shall be not." There is no record of his reply. She opened a saloon and broke up with Hull, with a local German doctor named as the co-respondent in the divorce. A few days after the divorce, the doctor was found murdered in the local hills, though there's no evidence that this was directly connected. That kind of thing happened a lot in the gold rush years. Lola spent 2 years living in Grass Valley. Among her neighbours was Jason Crabtree, a New Yorker who had gone west to run a boarding house. The same year as Lola moved to Grass Valley, John was joined by his wife and their 6-year-old daughter Lotta. Lola and Lotta struck up an unlikely friendship, and Lola taught the young girl how to dance. A year or so later, the Crabtrees moved to Rabbit Creek, where young Lotta made her stage debut. She combined charm with talent, and quickly became successful enough that her parents moved to San Francisco and got her a permanent gig at the Gaieties Theatre. Lotta moved into acting and became America's most famous child actress. She managed to keep her stardom as she became an adult, and by her 30s she was the most highly paid actress in America. Another life touched and changed by Lola Montez. By 1855, the California gold rush had ended. Lola had apparently got a taste for the scene, though, and she left California to head to Australia, where another gold mining rush was in full swing. She took a young actor named Ned Follen along as her manager and lover, and a company of young actors and dancers seeking adventure and excitement. They arrived in Sydney and opened a week later with a stage show called Lola Montez in Bavaria. After 2 weeks, they left by boat for Melbourne. One story has it that as they were waiting to depart, a bailiff appeared at Lola's cabin with a writ for her arrest due to an outstanding debt. She stripped naked and dared him to drag her out. He left empty-handed. In Melbourne, they first performed their stage show, and then, when the audience numbers began to drop, Lola added the spider dance. It was an instant success, but the papers and critics hated it. One even tried to have the mayor of Melbourne issue a warrant for her arrest for public indecency, but he refused. She toured on through Adelaide and Ballarat, where she publicly horsewhipped an editor who wrote a critical article. Overall, the Australian tour was a great success for Lola, albeit one with a tragic ending. As they returned to America, Follen, who Lola may have secretly married, fell overboard and was drowned. Back in America, Lola went on a lecture tour around the country and published a book. In The Arts of Beauty, she emphasized the importance of health to being beautiful. Ironically, her own health was beginning to fail. She stopped touring and settled in New York City, where she seems to have become more conscious of her own mortality. One newspaper wrote that she was, quote, living very quietly uptown and doesn't have much to do with the world's people. Some of her old friends, the Bohemians, now and then drop in to have a little chat with her, but she doesn't tell anybody what she's going to do. It's possible that she was infected with syphilis, which was incurable at the time. If so, she would have been suffering from the tertiary stage, the neurological or cardiovascular variant. Either could have been responsible for the stroke that she had in the summer of 1860. She spent several months bedridden, but in December, while out walking with a cane, she contracted pneumonia. She died on the 17th of January, exactly 1 month before her 40th birthday. Lola's death was announced in a 2-column obituary in the New York Herald, which was reprinted in both London and Sydney newspapers. The obituary describes her as being of Irish and Moorish Spanish descent, showing how well she had spun her myth over the years. Her mother was an Oliver, the obituary says, descended from Count de Montalvo of Spain. There was no Count de Montalvo in Lola's family tree, of course. She might have gotten the name from the famous Spanish author Garcia Rodriguez de Montalva, who invented the name California. The obituary also claims she was born in Limerick, which is the type of casual inaccuracy typical in newspapers of the era. Most of the obituary seems to be based on Lola's own fictional reinvention of her life, claiming she ran away from home because her mother planned to marry her off to a 60-year-old, for example. It also claims that her first husband was the one who abandoned her for another woman, a fairly blatant rewriting of history. She is credited for persuading the King of Bavaria to establish a parliamentary democracy, before being driven out of the country by angry nobles when she tried to introduce the Napoleonic Code of Justice. This also apparently angered the Jesuits, and Lola's influence in the story is clear when it claims they were responsible for all her ill fortune thereafter. The obituary becomes a bit more grounded when it comes to her time in America, describing her Broadway debut as a disappointment. It does praise her lecture series, giving a window into how she had been perceived in America. The New York Evening Post gave a much smaller obituary, and true to its conservative character, it concentrated on the idea that she'd become a devout Christian in her final days. One interesting claim in the Post article is that Lola was actually relatively well off at her death, and had enough money to settle all her debts and make several charitable bequests. Of course, this would not stop many biographers in the decades to come from claiming she had died in poverty, a much more satisfying conclusion for the armchair moralists. Lola is buried in Greenwood Cemetery in New York, with the name of Mrs. Eliza Gilbert on her grave. She bought the plot herself, so perhaps she also chose the name on her tombstone, even though she never used that name in life. Her age, too, is given as 42 rather than 39, with the birth year of 1818 that she had lied about decades before. Bruce Seymour, who wrote the definitive biography of Lola, was the one who found her birth certificate and settled that argument. He also paid to have Lola's grave restored after decades of neglect. Lola has not been forgotten over the years. She has appeared as a character in many films and drama, with her primary home in historical fiction. This was both as herself, in the Flashman series among other works, and as the clear inspiration for many heroines of Victorian novels. The most famous of these is undoubtedly Irene Adler, from the Sherlock Holmes stories. She was a popular performer who became attached to a European noble and threatened to bring down his kingdom. Carol Nelson Douglas paid homage to this in her series about Holmes by making Lola be Irene's mother. There is even a mountain in California named after her, and a song by the band Volbeat about her. 150 years later, Lola continues to fascinate. She was a rebel in a time when social class was everything. She refused to be pinned down by her background, which would have seen her be a dutiful wife and mother, and instead chose to live life by her own rules. Though her life might have been short, in that time she packed in more living than most of us could have managed in 100 years. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. And if you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.